Okay, good morning and most welcome for this event in our library reading room. It's nice to be back in presence, and welcome also to our online audience in WebEx today. We will discuss today fiscal and monetary policy, two sides of the same coin, and this event is part of a series that we are having for the Euro at 20. We had 2 weeks ago an event dedicated to the birth of the euro with the Delors report, and we had prominent guests there, Jacques de la Rosière, former governor of the Banque de France, and Neil Stigerson. And we will have in 2 weeks' time another event which will be dedicated to the euro as an international currency. And today we are going to look at fiscal and monetary policy, two sides of the same coin, with our guest here, Mrs. TINAGLI, who is chair of the ECON Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs, Lucio PENCH from the European Commission, Jérôme Zittelmeier from Bruegel, and Cynthia Alcidi, and the event will be moderated by Lasse Böhm from the EPRS. So, why this subject today? And let me put like 3 questions: where we come from, where we are now, and what we need for the future. Where we come from, the economic recovery from COVID-19 pandemic in Europe was unexpectedly strong, supported by decisive fiscal and monetary measures. In the third quarter of 2021, the EU economy was back to its quarterly pre-crisis output levels. In tandem with the pandemic recovery, the current economic environment is underpinned by the strongest labor market in decades. At the same time, first signs of broad-based price increases became evident by mid-2021. But then we had the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and the related energy crisis, and those dynamics have reversed or have been aggravated drastically. Second question, where we are now. Last week, the European Commission, when launching the 2023 European semester, spoke of a turning point for the EU economy. High inflation rates, supply shortages, high energy costs, increased debt levels, and rising borrowing costs, affecting business activity and eroding households' purchasing power. Real GDP growth in the EU is set to slow from 3.3% in 2022 to only 0.3% in 2023. At the same time, inflation is significantly above the ECB 2% inflation target, having risen to double digits towards the end of 2022 and to record highs since the launch of the Economic and Monetary Union. Against this backdrop of trends reversals, there is an increasingly urgency to put in place a sustainable economic governance framework and effective fiscal monetary coordination. Third point, what we need for the future. Related to EU's economic governance review on the 9th of November, the European Commission put forward a communication on the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, providing an outline on how key economic and policy issues should be addressed. Drawing lessons not only from COVID-19 crisis, but also from the financial crisis, how can we make sure that a new economic governance framework and its coordination with monetary policy can be effective and sustainable answer to the twin transition? These questions are at the heart of our discussions today. And we are privileged and honored to have with us today the chair of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. Despite a very busy schedule, we are very thankful to her to be here today, Mrs. TINAGLI. I understand you have 3 events today. Just to say a few words, you have been member of the European Parliament in the group of NSD since 2019, and you're chair of ECON. You're also a member of the subcommittee on tax matters, and you're also a member of the delegation for relations with the United States. You were elected in 2013 to the Italian Parliament, where you served for a 5-year term, dealing mostly with issues concerning labor, employment, and the private sector. So most welcome here for this event in the EPRS, and over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Just a correction, I don't have 3 events today. I already had 3 events this morning, so this is I have other 4 events in the upcoming hours, and then the 3rd trialogue on Repower EU, which will take the rest of the day, of the evening. So, but it's a pleasure. I'm really happy to be here, and I really want to thank EPRS for organizing this interest meeting and you know, to have invited me to give an introductory remark. I think I would start with a question that the citizens asked me a few weeks ago at a public event on the reform of the economic governance, and the question was, but why? I mean, why does a monetary union need fiscal rules? Why are you talking so much about it? And the question was so tricky that you know, it took me a few seconds to keep my thoughts together and to think of an adequate answer. And then, you know, I told him that we need them because we have to safeguard member states against the externalities generated by fiscal policies of the other member states, since we share the same currency and capital and labor are free to move from one country to another. So it's important to take into account this externality, etc. But then, you know, I kept thinking back to my answer later on, and I think that maybe a more honest answer would have been warranted. And maybe I should have said that we need fiscal rules because the economic and monetary union was built in a certain way, with a common currency, yes, but without a federal government, and where fiscal sovereignty is still fully with member states' governments. So this is why we need some rules to, you know, coordinate and take into account this lack of European capacity and federal government. So if you look back, you know, the existing economic governance is the product of the cultural and political climate that was prevailing in the 80s and 90s, where basically there was this confidence in the self-regulatory regulative capacity of markets was basically unlimited, but you know, the need and the effectiveness of an active fiscal policies was considered limited. And then, you know, there was monetary policy that was the universal panacea for all the possible residual stabilization purposes. So this was a little bit the framework. But then the subsequent 3 decades have been characterized by profound economic, social, political changes related to the 3 global scale crises that we had to face. The global financial crisis and the 2008-2009 Great Recession, the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine. So the Great Recession was the first serious stress test for the economic and monetary union. In those months, the whole world discovered that monetary policy alone was not enough. With interest rates close to or even below 0, and the economy showing symptoms of secular stagnation, fiscal policy has been reassessed as a necessary and indeed powerful tool to trigger recovery and ensure that it's stable and sustainable over time. However, I think the lesson was probably not understood very well. And indeed, you know, if I look back at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis and the disastrous economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic at the beginning of 2020, well, I think that, and I thought at the time, maybe we didn't learn the lessons that well, because at the very beginning, the first measures were taken by the ECB alone, if you recall, and with this extraordinary quantitative easing plan. But the EU fiscal response was quite hesitant at the beginning, so we struggled to make progress on that. National governments and the Commission decided to temporarily suspend budgetary rules, but it became increasingly clear that just leaving the capacity for health, economic and social response to each single member state's fiscal space would rapidly increase the risk of a collective catastrophe, both from a sanitary perspective, economic perspective, disruption of the single market. So it became obvious that that was not the right way to go. And then after lengthy and quite tense intergovernmental negotiations, we reached the definition of the large-scale EU fiscal plan, which we all know and celebrate today, the next generation EU, whose purpose was to supplement monetary policy encompassing significant innovative elements such as raising financial resources via the issue of Eurobonds. And I think that after 2 years, I think we can see how effective the response was. And I really want to stress that, because now we look at it as if it was something normal, but it was not normal. It was difficult to get there. It was historical, the achievement that we made, the agreement that was made. But most importantly, I think it's historic, the result that we got. If you look back at the previous recession, the great financial recession, 2008 and 9, how many years did it take for member states and the European Union to go back to pre-crisis level of GDP? And how much time did it take with the next generation EU, with the EU response, with the common response? Less than 2 years. Because prior to the war in Ukraine, most member states were already back to the pre-crisis level in 1.5 years. So we have to think about that. I hope that this can be a lessons learned. And then the war in Ukraine confirmed once again, I think, how monetary and fiscal policies should be used jointly. Although I think that we are still here struggling in really learning the lesson. So, of course, we have the monetary policy, we have the national fiscal policies, but we are still struggling with the EU fiscal response. But this is a situation that it's very complicated, and where it's evident that the two things should go hand in hand, where inflation reflects sectoral imbalances associated, for instance, with the prolonged energy shock. The coordination of monetary, fiscal, and structural policies is necessary to ensure that inflation pressures do not start a wage price spiral, and to protect the most vulnerable from the impact of high inflation and economic recession. So this is where we are. We know that the problem is there. We are still struggling with the answer, but at least I think we know that the two things has to go hand in hand. So now the debate on the economic governance is ongoing for very long time, and probably people here have been hearing about that for even longer than me. And the analysis of the European crisis and stagnation in the last decade have shifted the judgment pendulum in the direction of a growing anachronism of the existing fiscal rules. And I think everybody realizes that it's quite unfeasible to go back to the pre-pandemic status quo. And so I think that 3 lessons from the last decade might be useful when we want to think about how to define the new rules. First is that an entirely rules-based approach is ineffective, because rules are static and cannot be updated quickly when unforeseen circumstances arise. And we had quite a lot of unforeseen circumstances in the past few years. So we know that they can happen, that they're not impossible possibilities. They can happen. So rules that apply only in fair weather conditions end up producing uncertainty. In the end, rather than generating stability, an entirely rule-based governance would generate instability, including by destabilizing expectations. So, simply suspending the rules because we cannot apply them in exceptional circumstances, I don't think it's the right answer, and it doesn't give any certainty about that. So the second lesson is that drawing up rules capable of taking into account of all potential future events is impossible. So it's increasing the number of contingencies quickly leads to highly complex rules which are difficult to apply and easier to manipulate and even circumvent. And we've seen them all. And it's not coincidence that democratic constitutions are a system of general abstract principle rather than specific rules and strict ones. So translating principles into rules of contingent conduct is a legal process that in turn follows applicative rules and measures which necessarily leave a controlled discretion margin. This discretionary element is a necessary evil. I know that nobody likes it, but it's a necessary evil in incomplete contracts. And the purpose of constitutions, and including our economic governance, should be to regulate it, not to remove it. A denial of discretion will simply push discretion behind curtains of opaque and arbitrary bargaining in which politics inevitably returns to the fore. As a politician, I would say justly so, but this is what happens. So, and the third lesson is that delegating fiscal policy entirely to individual member states, constrained only by a set of rules which ignore macroeconomic externalities, is no longer possible. And I think we had loads of evidence about it. The era of do your homework alone, I think, is over. And individual state budgetary policies must be more effectively controlled and at the same time coordinated and harmonized to maintain a balanced euro area fiscal stance in order to minimize negative spillovers from individual budgetary policies onto other member states. So the recent Commission's communication on the review of the economic governance, I think, moves in the right direction. So there are many positive elements that, don't worry, I will not go into all the details because you have a panel and everything, so I'm not going to address all the details, but I just want to discuss briefly two of them. The first is that the focus has shifted from the annual budget to medium-term public debt sustainability assessment. And I think this latter is a more comprehensive framework within which the current state of public finance and its future evolution may be determined. So it will make possible to accommodate ex-ante desirable allowances rather than picking them up in ex-post negotiations, and could potentially amend the anti-investment bias that was embedded in the previous, I would say, current economic governance. And the second is that the medium-term public debt sustainability assessment and the debt reduction path will be country-specific, therefore eliminating the reference to fixed targets that are valid for all without distinctions, and especially the fixed path. This will allow to better assess the future evolution of debt, taking into account of the specific features of each member state with references to growth, population dynamics, interest rates trend, but also current and future budgetary policies. There may be many different reasons why a country has a high debt or has a problem. So you have to address the specific problem of that country to make sure that you are capable of really decreasing the debt and make it sustainable. So let me stress that while conducted at the single member state level, the debt sustainability analysis should also need to pay attention to the cross-country spillovers and the resulting aggregate fiscal stance of the Union as a whole. Debt sustainability risks should be balanced against the cost of adjustment in terms of production, with the explicit goal of averting a debt crisis for the individual member state and the European Monetary Union as a whole. So, at the beginning, in my introduction, I referred to the big changes that characterized the last decade. In my view, the main lesson for the monetary union is that not only fiscal rules need to be amended, but also that the new rules must also be complemented by a system of safeguards designed to protect the monetary union's integrity in the event of systemic shocks. It's interesting how the Commission's public consultation itself reveals how the vast majority of stakeholders underline the importance of this aspect. If Next Generation EU, and in particular instruments like SURE, were to become a permanent EU tools, national budgetary constraints might immediately gain a political ownership and be easier to control, because a significant part of the macroeconomic stabilization task would be entrusted in the common budget, which would be mainly funded by states-owned resources. So if the political will for this is not there, I'm afraid that the new rules will need again a lot of flexibility and will be subject again to continuous political opaque negotiations. And I think these are issues that we need to think about, because these are the things that make our citizens to lose trust and confidence in the European institutions. When they have the impression that we set this enormous amount of perfect rules that nobody abides. And then there are negotiations behind the curtain. So I think that we need to be realistic. I think that we need to be open with each other. I think we need to be transparent. And I think we need to look forward and think about the union that we want to build. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair TINAGLI, for setting out the challenges that we're facing, for explaining the path that we've taken together as a euro area and the European Union as a whole, and also for your bold perspective on some of the questions that we're now confronted with. My name is Lasse Böhm. I'm moderating this panel. A warm welcome to my three panelists here. A warm welcome to the audience here in the room, and of course the online audience. I know a lot of colleagues are connected online. I would like to encourage the audience, both in the room as well as online, to ask questions to the panel throughout the event, which will be taken up by my colleagues and put to the panel. If you do so, please introduce yourself very briefly and ask a question. So ask a question and be brief in asking a question, because we would like to discuss these extremely complex questions. We are, of course, sitting here in a room which is enveloped in fog at the moment. So for those of you who are in the European Parliament, you will have noticed that the fog descended on this building just when we were about to start. I hope this is not a metaphor for the event, but I'm sure that the three panelists will be able to illuminate us on many of these questions. So I'm very privileged and proud to have gotten Lucio PENCH to come and join us this morning. Lucio, I'm not sure whether you have a nickname in DG ECFIN. Can I venture a proposal? Maybe if you do have a nickname, perhaps it's Mr. Did It All in DG ECFIN, because if I look at your CV, you have spent almost your entire professional career at DG ECFIN. You are currently, of course, Director for Macroeconomic Policies and one of the authors of the most recent Commission communication. And it's an immense privilege to have you here. I know you have a few slides for us, setting out the Commission's view, not only on the communication itself, I hope, but also going slightly beyond it. But this will, we might tease you a little bit in the. Lucio, it's a great pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for coming. To my left in the room, I have Cinzia Alcidi, who is a well-known guest, of course, of both the European Parliament and EPRS, as Director for Research and Head of the Economic Policy Unit at the Center for European Policy Studies. A warm welcome to you, Cinzia. And to your left, Jeroen Zettelmeijer, who is already in a very short time has become a well-known face in Brussels. I think that's fair to say. You have a very distinguished career, of course, in economic policy making, both as a policy maker in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs, as well as at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And most recently, before you became Director of Bruegel, your current position, of course, you were Deputy Director of the Strategy and Policy Review Department at the International Monetary Fund. And I know you have been an expert and a main commentator on these issues for a very long time. So a warm welcome to all of you again. Please do ask questions in the chat if you wish, and I am happy to give the microphone to Lucio before passing it on to Cinzia and Jeroen for a first round of reflections, and then of course the questions. Lucio, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. Yeah, for this kind introduction. I have a few slides, if one can put them on the screen. They focus on, well, the news of the day or of the month, if you wish, namely the recent Commission proposal orientation, let's say, for the reform of fiscal governance, and in particular, here I will focus on fiscal rule. As we have heard also in the introductory remark of Irene TINAGLI, clearly this issue linked to many others, and hopefully, I mean, I will be up to the challenge to answering the question that you may have. But let me say that the focus is on the fiscal framework, and I'll try to be brief. I just will have 3 slides, basically describing what we are starting from, I mean, to pick up from the initial introduction, namely the framework which is currently de facto suspended. You have it there, consisting of 2 arms. I will not go into the detail of the rules that are supposed to be in place. I say supposed because since COVID, as it was, we were reminded effectively there has been a suspension of this rule. But even before the COVID crisis erupted, observer, not least the Commission, which published a communication at the very eve of the pandemic, a review communication, basically taking stock of how the reform that had taken place about 10 years before had fared, identified a number of challenges. So I will focus on that. I think the challenge on which everybody agrees, although then views tend to differ immediately afterwards, is the challenge of complexity. Some people, given my background to which kindly refer to, like to say that I am the only person that is supposed to know all the rules, and then I would add, quoting Lord Palmerston about the Schleswig-Holstein issue, I was the only person, but I guess I'm forgetting something of it. So it's a very big issue, right? So complexity is there. I mean, one of the aspect of this complexity, perhaps the most visible one, is the multiplicity of rule have indicator. The other, I will not follow necessarily the order, but let's focus what are the most important. The other that is generally recognized because it's in the data is essentially a low degree of effectiveness of enforcement. So one thing are the rule on paper, the other, and we have carried out, and other colleagues and observers have carried out analysis, another thing is the behavior of countries. Then the question is where this comes from, and clearly there the view also, as you imagine, differs. Some would say, well, it is because the European institutions are not forceful enough in enforcing the rule. That may be part of the explanation, but then you have to ask yourself a further question, why it is so. And we have heard that, I mean, monetary union is a very unique animal. I mean, the fiscal sovereignty still remains located in the hands of member states. So I think that it should be recognized that at least part of the story is what you see there in terms of lack of ownership of the rule has been a fatal weakness in that since fiscal sovereignty in the end is in the hands of member states. If member states don't feel this rule as theirs, I mean, inevitably we will have problem implementation. And then there are 2 other issues that you see there, which have come to the fore, perhaps more recently. The rule was felt by many to be constraining, too much constraining in terms of giving, for example, incentive for investment. And in some respect where, especially when it comes to high debt country, they impose a pace of debt reduction that, in the light of the circumstances, many felt was unrealistic. So this is a bit, as I say, some aspects of this diagnosis are broadly shared, others, as I pointed out, are matter of discussion. So let's see, and this is my second slide, so don't be worried, I will not be long. What the new fiscal framework is about. So basically, you see in these 3 pillars, just to give you the philosophy, the idea is that we try to tackle these challenges, we try to tackle the challenges. So, national ownership, it is an important issue, perhaps key issues. as I pointed out. At the same time, we have to reconcile national ownership with the need of a common framework. Well, precisely because we have a monetary union. And how we try to sort this, this conundrum? Well, basically, we have an approach that it is supposed to be more tailored to the needs of member states. So instead of imposing a one-size-fits-all numerical fiscal rule, say everybody has to reach an objective of close to balance or in surplus in 3 to 5 years, we have medium-term plan, which again are not anchored in a simple numerical rule. They are anchored in an assessment of their sustainability. So there is differentiation there. At the same time, okay, where the EU element comes from, I mean, because the risk there or the allegation there is that we are creating a bit of a free-for-all. Well, there is a common EU framework that takes and I will go into detail if there are questions, takes the form upstream of reference paths issued by the Commission, and also takes the form of a underlying debt sustainability analysis, which serves to differentiate member state in a more sophisticated way, let's say, that a crude numerical rule. Simplification. You may say this looks good, but it's fairly complicated. It is actually an allegation that always get when it comes to debt sustainability analysis. So the point I would like to stress is that, yes, DSA, debt sustainability analysis, is there, but it is in the background. It serves to differentiate country. It serves as a tool to assess the path. But once you have a path, which, by the way, doesn't come from the Commission, it is ultimately decided by the Council, which is the political instance that has the only legitimacy, let's say, to do so. The things become very simple because essentially what you have is a single indicator, primary expenditure net of discretionary revenue measure and cyclical unemployment. And basically, the answer I often got in my career, this type of objection from representatives of member states, I don't know what to tell my minister if he or she asks me what I have to do to respect the euro. Well, now there will be a medium-term path for expenditure, if you stay, which is under the control of the government, because we are speaking of primary expenditure, so we leave endogenous fluctuation in revenues, go free. And then if you keep your path medium-term wise, you're done. Very simple. Then it will become a very simple number. So we are doing away in the process with the multiplicity of rules. It was one of the most often quoted element of complexity, of excessive complexity in the system, and there you see the long list of things, of rules and procedures that go away. Last point, enforcement, that, as I noted, is always, well, sorry, I'm still in the previous slide. Well, essentially, enforcement will be simplified in that the excessive deficit procedure stands. By the way, as you probably know, it is in the treaty, so even if we wish to, and it's not our intention to do away with that, I mean, it would be impossible short of changing the treaty that we know for many reasons is a complete taboo. So never was the idea. Essentially, though, the EDP will be repurposed to serve to enforce the debt, the fiscal trajectory, with a clear differentiation in terms of risk. I mean, because clearly it is countries with the most substantial debt challenge where a deviation from the trajectory poses the biggest risk of externalities for the Union as a whole. We are also thinking of making a sanction, I know that this is a very tall order, smarter. The idea was that the macroeconomic significance of the sanction in the end was counterproductive, so a more reputational dimension would be important. So let me conclude. with the last slide, very briefly to illustrate a bit, and again, I will not go into all the detail, the challenge that we felt we had and how we tried, I mean, to rise to the challenge. I mean, what I call here the balancing act. So basically you have two dimensions. You want to have the rules owned by member state, as I said, which demands a degree of differentiation. At the same time, you want to have common rules, I mean, precisely because here we are speaking of issues of externalities, I mean, that are shared at least by the member of monetary union. So there are, in turn, two dimensions of this trade-off. In terms of governance, basically, we are stressing the element of dialogue with member states. So this is a bit the inspiration from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is quoted also in the communication. In other words, yes, the Commission will put forward some references, but it stands to reason that the final part that will be adopted will be probably different from them and will be the process of technical dialogue and ultimately, yes, a political process, I mean, because it will be the Council that will endorse that. At the same time, I mean, you don't want to go too much into the individualization of bilateralism has been accused. There is a common framework, and I try to explain the way it takes, the DSA, the initial reference part. Then you want to differentiate based essentially on sustainability risk, but you want to have also an element of simplicity, and this is based in the common rule. Broadly, there is also, and already some member states have picked up on it, and with different views. Yes, there is more leeway compared to the previous system, on an ex-ante basis, mainly. Try to explain. This, however, should be accompanied by more stringent enforcement. And it is a bet. Let me say, I mean, there are some Italian economists and that came up with the idea, well, after all, influential economists, not too bad for Italy to keep the rule as they are. But then what they make clear is that it's not the rule as they are on paper. There was an exchange on an Italian daily, La Stampa, some of you may have seen it. But you know the rule has been managed so far. So basically say, well, rather than having more leeway ex-ante, which will be the transparent approach, we can live with the rule that ex-ante seems quite stringent because we know that ex-post we will be managing them. And we think that this actually has contributed to the crisis of the rule, so it would be better to have a more transparent framework. In terms of outcome, okay, and here I'm getting to the end, of course, it is early to say what the outcome would be. The idea is that we have a trade-off. We want to give incentive to growth-enhancing policy, inter-reform of investment. But, and let me stress it, because I agree with those, and Cinzia is one of them who said that too many things are being asked from a single set of fiscal rules. Let me be clear, and the communication of the Commission is, I think, very clear on that. The chief purpose of the rule remains that of ensuring debt sustainability and ensuring against the externalities in terms of the policy mix and financial contagion that may happen, especially in monetary union. Then again, we have to be realistic in terms of what can be exacted in monetary state, but at the same time, we have to, and this goes back to the issues that I had before of flexibility ex ante and more rigor ex post, ensure effective adjustment. Of course, it's a very tall order. I think I'm personally and professionally happy that early criticism, at least from economists, have been quite positive. So I like to say, I like to conclude with a movie comparison. You know, when a new movie comes out, you have the critical review and then you have the box office. Here, I dare say that in terms of critical review, we are getting some nice reviews. So this, I mean, a professional in the field, you feel happy about that, to have the recognition of the peers. When it comes to the box office, which is the political process, well, question remain open. And I'll stop here. Many thanks.
Thank you, Lucio. I take up your image of the movie in the box office, since we're moving towards Christmas and a lot of old films are being shown. Everyone has a tradition of watching his or her favorite film on TV, which is being repeated around Christmas. My question to the two other panelists is, which film are we sitting in? Is it yet another repeat of the same discussion that we have had for the last 10 years? Or is this the start of maybe a new film, which Lucio has been directing together with his colleagues at the European Commission? Curious to hear your view. I suggest Cinzia first, and then Irene.
First of all, many thanks for having me here. It's a really great pleasure to be back in this beautiful room full of light, and of course having a meeting in person. The question about the movie. I think we are in the production of a new movie, but it's not yet ready, so still some work to do. To get a bit of a sense why this, I think it's a new movie, let me actually share with you some thoughts which are very much related to the introductory speech of Vice President TINAGLI, President of the Econ Committee, TINAGLI. I think it's really important to look at the three crises which have characterized about 10 years. So, and every time we thought it was the kind of crisis that you see once in a lifetime, and we had three basically in a little bit more than 10 years. They all had somehow a global or an international dimension, because financial crisis started as a global financial crisis, then we had our own debt crisis. The pandemic, of course, it was global shock. And then the war at our door, but also a very strong global dimension, because basically the biggest issue for us is really now the energy prices. So three big crises, very different in nature. From an economic point of view, maybe one simplistic way to see them, it is financial shock, then supply and demand shock altogether. And then the energy crisis, I look at it mostly as a supply shock. And I will get back in a moment to why I think this is important. But one clear aspect that I think it's important to assess is that given a different nature, the answer to the shock needs to be different. And it has been different in good and in bad. Now, when it comes to the global financial crisis, the debt crisis more specifically, as it was said by Irene TINAGLI, one of the problems at that moment was that reaction was rather slow, and it was quite limited from the EU perspective. I mean, ex ante, there has been a lot of criticism, ex post. A lot of criticism. It's always very easy to criticize ex post. Once you know how things went, when you are on the moment, it's much more difficult. But I think one clear feature of the response at that time was the division that was characterizing the EU in that moment. The big division between the North and the South, the creditor and the debtor countries. So also in terms of political debate, and the political debate that was behind the answer to that crisis, it was actually quite nasty, and certainly not one of a united union which is providing a response to a shock. And this, I think, is to a large extent responsible for why basically the response it was not very successful, and to some countries basically it took about a decade to go back to the pre-crisis levels of GDP. Some countries actually remained below. COVID was completely different because the response, I think it was immediate. So it was not on the same date, but it was immediate. The ECB responded immediately. It was clear that it was one of the big players in that game. But also from the European side, the response was quite important, sure, but also the next generation EU. And it was united, and the discourse was completely different. It was clearly presented as a solidaristic response to the crisis, where countries basically agree on the fact that there is need for fiscal response at the level of the member states and at the level of the EU. Now, the big question is, with the energy crisis, are we going to see something which is similar to COVID, or something which will lead us back to the kind of response that we had during the global financial crisis? And my assessment is that at the very beginning, that there was a clear common position. So we need to stand united and to give a common response to this crisis. I think that there is that the narrative is continuing in the direction of we need to remain united, but I think this winter is going to be a big test because the moment will come when countries may be facing different realities, and they may be facing different room of maneuver to respond to the current situation. And this may lead to fragmentation. And I think this risk is likely to be increased by the different macroeconomic conditions which we are living in now, very different from COVID, and somehow reminding us of the situation of the global financial crisis, though with some key differences. So during COVID, interest rates were basically at zero. So when you have the EU proposing a big package, member states, even the more reluctant, may still show some willingness to put some effort, also assuming that basically this money will have a zero interest cost on it. So macroeconomic conditions, in a sense, were very favorable, or easier, if you want, to have a common response. Now we are moving in a situation, we are actually already in a situation where inflation is very high, so it's completely different macroeconomic environment. I'm certainly not the youngest in the room, but basically I have no memory of high inflation period in my life. This is to say that it will require really a very big shift in the approach, also in monetary policy. The ECB has never faced a situation of high inflation. Until a couple of years ago, the big problem was deflationary risks. And also we have interest rates increasing. So this will basically means that interest rates are increasing for governments who have to borrow because of the current context and because of inflation. And the ECB is basically forcing to increase interest rates and basically trying to call off demand in order to compensate a shock which largely comes from the supply. So I think this is a context which is quite challenging, and in which I think that the political will and an approach whereby member states should stand together becomes even more important, exactly because the economic conditions and macroeconomic circumstances are rather unfavorable. I will leave it here, but I think it's something we can continue to discuss later on. Thank you.
Thank you, and we will certainly come back to this interplay between monetary and fiscal policy. Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So I'm just going to focus on the Commission's communication on the economic governance reform, and within that on the fiscal rules. So sort of just to confirm that what Lucio was saying, I think it's sort of mostly a critical hit, with some caveats, as is always the case. So, why do I think that, and what are the caveats? So one way of thinking about this proposal, in a way that also maybe presages a little bit or anticipates a little bit whether it might be a box office hit or not, is to remind ourselves of a debate that took place earlier this year where various member states, probably to influence the Commission, came up with conditions or sort of requirements that they thought a reform of the fiscal rules should meet. And to my surprise, there was a reasonable amount of commonality in these requirements. So one was a paper by the Germans in the summer, then there was a previous paper that was actually co-written by the Dutch and the Spanish. And with some differences and nuances, they basically said the same. And so one can summarize it is in terms of four main points, or sort of a wish list of 4 points to the Commission. The first is that the core objective of the reform should be to ensure debt sustainability, and I'm quoting, in a more effective and efficient manner than had been the case under the current rules. Then the second was that, there is a sense that other fiscal policies also matter, not just debt sustainability, and then particularly public investment, and also some room to do stabilization policy, and that room should be created by the rules without compromising the first objective, namely debt sustainability. The third, it was a sense that, because the current rules were so complicated, they basically led to a de facto application of the rules that was sort of quite different from what you would expect if you just thought, the rules are going to be followed literally. Moreover, there were previous communications by the Commission on flexible implementation and so forth, and so the general sense, particularly by the more conservative member states, but this was also, subscribed to by a country like Spain, was that, de facto, the rules are really mostly a cover for a bilateral negotiation between the Commission and the member states, and we don't like this, right? Because it's going to be political, and it may undermine the objective of even-handedness, with maybe bigger countries getting better deals than smaller countries. So it's sort of interesting that this argument came actually from at least two of the bigger countries, but nonetheless it was made, and I think it's an important point. And then the final point was sort of this agreement, and particularly forcefully in the Dutch-Spanish paper, that what really is lacking in the current system is good implementation. And so this had to be upgraded. And, part of this is enforcement, but I think there's a sort of shared sense that the limits, there are very strong, very tight limits to enforcement in a system where countries are essentially sovereign in fiscal matters, and the usual enforcement mechanism in the European Union, which is the treaty infringement procedure, is explicitly ruled out by the treaty. And so the only way we can really improve implementation is through stronger national ownership. So that was sort of a fourth point. Really need to strengthen national ownership. Okay, so let me perhaps just evaluate this proposal with respect to those 4 points. And I think the reason why it's fair to do that is because I actually agree with most of these points. I particularly agree with the first two, and what I've said was the last. Maybe I should have reversed the order and put that third. Then there's a debate on whether discretion by the Commission is a good thing or a bad thing, and I've usually not felt as strongly about this as some of my German compatriots. But certainly these 3 points, we need a better, more effective and more efficient system for the purpose of ensuring debt sustainability. We need sort of an intelligent management of trade-offs, and we need to strengthen national ownership. Those are really key objectives. And then there comes this additional objective of let's not do bilateral negotiations. Okay, so how would I score the Commission's proposal on those 4 fronts? So I think on the first 2, it's a real hit. It passes with flying colors, at least for my sort of in my intellectual world. I mean, I should also say that I'm among those that has been actively sort of encouraging and egging on the Commission to actually go for that sustainability analysis. So how could I not like this? So that sustainability analysis approach that largely replaces rules here, with the exception of the operational implementation rule, which is the net expenditure rule, which is totally fine. And in fact, a big improvement over the current operational rule, which is mostly, not only, but mostly about the structural fiscal balance. So this is a very good way. It is indeed efficient because you are using all available information to assess whether there is a sustainability problem or not. And so you are unlikely to commit these very strong type 1 or type 2 errors where you take, countries that are fundamentally in a pretty good fiscal position violate some rule and you have to tell them to adjust, and then countries that maybe are in a weaker position but perhaps because of the cycle they don't violate a rule, they don't get enough encouragement to create fiscal buffers. You're less likely to make these mistakes if you have a risk-based approach that uses all available information. And DSAs are just like that, right? DSAs are simply a structured method to use all available information. And so, check on the first point. Check also on the second point, on the sort of trade-offs between, the fiscal adjustment, reform, and public investment in particular. And here sort of the Commission actually does something really bold and impressive, which is to say we're going to actually look at this or these, we're going to evaluate these in the same framework, right? So in a way, this is truly more than just a revision of the fiscal rules. Even if you ignore the bit about the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, which is at the end and which Lucio hasn't talked much about, even if you just focus on the fiscal governance, it's more than fiscal governance because this is a unified framework to assess, encourage, incentivize economic reform and public investment by explicitly recognizing that with respect to the sustainability objective, there may be a trade-off between investment and reform on the one hand and fiscal adjustment on the other hand. And so to the extent that there are in fact substitutes, which may not always be the case, right? So you can have very good public investment that does not pay for itself in terms of higher growth in the past, like some forms of green investment. But in some cases, public investment really is a way of strengthening potential output and growth. The RRF has a lot of this. Clearly, with respect to Italy in particular, we all feel that there has been this trade-off. So it's fair for if a country comes up with very strong investment reform plans to say, okay, you have to adjust less because from a DSA perspective, these have equivalent impacts. So these are very strong points. And then finally, on just on the technical execution, I think the net expenditure rule is also a good thing. So flying colors on the first two. Okay, now with respect to I'm now going to reverse the order because I want to go from the most enthusiastic to the least enthusiastic. So I'm going to come up with the national ownership thing as the middle thing. So with respect to national ownership, I think this is sort of a glass half full. And the reason is that there's sort of good and bad about national ownership. So the good news is that merely by a really silly system that was in a sense almost inevitably going to lead to frictions in its implementation between the national level and the Commission, merely by adopting a sensible system, national ownership will improve. Now, the bad news is that the Commission, in my view, did not go as far enough to empower the national level and to limit itself to the correction of gross errors, which is what people like the European Fiscal Board and to some extent the IMF, where I was working until recently, told them, as they could have. So it is a very Commission-centric proposal, right? The Commission really runs the show in this proposal. It proposes a reference path. It then comments, takes a view on the medium-term plan that comes back from the country, and then there's this really odd, wild sentence in the communication that in the event that the Commission and the Council and the Member State disagree, the Commission and the Council will make the reference path the basis for surveillance. Now, Lucio himself just said that, you know, this cannot really be, right? So if they disagree, the Council would do whatever it likes, and that may very well be something else than the reference path. But there is this apodictic sentence in there that really sounds like the system is set up in a way that if there's a disagreement between the Member States and the Commission automatically wins. So I don't really know why they did this. I mean, they will have good reasons, because I'm sure that every word in this communication was reflected 15 times and probably, you know, tested with focus groups from the Member States. But there's this thing. So for me, it feels very top-down, this proposal, very heavy-handed, and you know, the national level, particularly national independent fiscal institutions, do not participate as much as they should. And then that brings me to the final point, which is sort of this sort of desire by the Member States to avoid a system which amounts to a bilateral negotiation between the country and the Commission. So on this one, okay, I'm going to give the Commission one redeeming point on the last one, which is that what they're proposing is quite transparent. So they want to set out the reference path and explain it and justify it and sort of open their spreadsheets and so forth. So I don't think that they can be necessarily accused of negotiating in secret with the country. Nonetheless, I find it really provocative that you respond to sort of this widespread sense that the current system is de facto, not de jure, a negotiation process between the Commission and the Member State, by proposing something which is de jure a negotiation between the Member State and the Commission. So this is the way it comes across. I've heard this now many times from the future visitors to the movie theater. What the Commission is doing here can be summarized with one sentence: we get rid of all the rules and replace it by a negotiation. And that's why we don't like this proposal. Now, I don't agree with this characterization. I think it goes too far, but I can totally see how one gets to that impression. Now, the final point, because now sort of you will probably remember the critical side of my remarks more than my enthusiastic introduction, is that I think, and we are about to publish a blog on this, on Bruegel, with Olivier Blanchard, who is sort of my original co-author in actually sort of encouraging the Commission to be bold, and boy, bold they have been, right? I mean, congratulations on courage. So the final point is that I do think that these flaws, as I would call them, in the proposal can be fixed. So you can do two things. You can be much more precise on how, in a sense, the discretion and the potential for abuse of discretion through a negotiation process can be limited, but by just making it even clearer how you're going to come up with the reference path and what the effective constraints are to Member States when they come back with their response, right? So the Commission actually has been somewhat more precise than I thought when I first read through this thing, because there is some material in a box which you should not miss. The box puts some structure on what it means to quote one sort of catchphrase in the communication to be to target a plausibly declining debt path, right? So when I first heard, okay, our main constraint to avoid this becoming a free-for-all is that we will target a plausibly declining debt path after 47 to 7 years, plausibly and continuously declining debt path. My whole IMF desk economist instincts kicked in and said, well, plausibly? Are you kidding me? What is plausibly, okay? Does it mean it's more likely than not it will decline, like with 50%, 51% probability it will decline? Well, it turns out that's not how they mean it, right? So they have a box where they explain how they mean it, but it can be made even clearer, I think. And then I think, and this is the stuff that's so hard to swallow for the Commission, I think that on the national ownership thing, really the Commission does need to give a bigger role to the national level. And the only way they can do that without then, in a sense, throwing out the baby with the bathwater and letting the national level just do whatever it likes, is to empower independent fiscal institutions more. And so there are some hints in the proposal that they want to go into this direction, but it's not at all fleshed out. And so that is a bit disappointing, right? Because that is not only what various observers, including the fund, the EFP, have been calling for, but I think that Lucio himself wrote a Docs EU Please several years ago, which was exactly about this point. And so you kind of miss it in there, you know, and in part of the reason I feel, but this is now speculative and don't take it too seriously, why the Commission is hesitant to go there is because, of course, sort of a general call for empowering independent fiscal institutions is a little bit of a threat to the Commission, because we now have competing surveillance authorities, in a sense. And this Commission is completely right that there is one and only one surveillance authority in the treaty, which is the Commission. But nonetheless, if we're going to go with higher national ownership, some of the surveillance function has to be ceded, I think, to national independent fiscal institutions, which is difficult in part because they are actually quite weak and barely noticeable, right? So my colleague Greg Klaes did an interesting blog 3 years ago where he looked just at press mentions. They are barely visible, with one exception in the EU, and today's EU, which is IREF, the Spanish one. And then, of course, the other shining example for all what we may think about weaknesses of UK institutions is the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK. So we need more of this type of interaction. And I really hope that, you know, this is going to be the next move by the Commission. I hope this is going to be the start of a very happy conversation where, you know, these parts of the proposals that are not there yet get strengthened and brought out more.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Cinzia. I think there's a lot of unpacking to do, and you've pointed the finger where it might hurt or it might not hurt. That's up to Lucio to say. I couldn't quite figure out whether you liked the movie, Irene, but you clearly went to see it. So you went, you know, you took time out and you paid, presumably. So I think there seems to be agreement that this could be a new movie in town and not the repeat of the old show that we've been witnessing in about 10 years. I see you nodding there for the online audience. Yeah, okay. So that's the interesting thing about this proposal. So let's try and unpack this a little bit. Maybe going back to a very basic question, which Irene alluded to by focusing on the Council and the 4 objectives. And I put this question to Lucio, of course. What are your objectives in this proposal? I mean, what's your perspective? What are you trying to achieve? What is the Commission trying to achieve? Is it more about debt sustainability, or is it more about investment? Or would you take the easy route and say it's obviously about both? But can you sort of put a primary objective to the various objectives which are in this framework?
Well, to give a short answer and picking up... to give a short answer and picking up on what I was saying, debt sustainability remains the main purpose of the rules. Now, actually, some economists would say debt sustainability is not an objective, it's a constraint. So I don't want to get into the technical discussion, but let me, though, stress a point. We recognize this precisely because we have a much bigger role for the debt sustainability analysis up front. So before, you could say, if you objected to the rule, well, you could say to a country, you should have a different path, and you could get the retort. Why so? Well, because you have to get a balanced budget. And then they may ask you, why should we get a balanced budget? And in economic terms, we know that, well, it's not very easy to defend. Now, essentially, we say, although clearly debt sustainability analysis, some would say, is more an art than a science, still, we think that you should follow a certain path, because if you go beyond that, there are serious risks to sustainability. And so you're going to have problem whether or not we tell you, in a sense, because reality at some point kicks in. For this reason, and let me make a point on investment, and there was quite a bit of an internal discussion, internal to the Commission, but also, in the public debate. We refused the idea, the rather popular idea, of a golden rule. Because essentially a golden rule makes sense when you have some kind of arbitrary fiscal rule, so balanced budget, and then you say, but we need to do more investment, and so I give you 1 point more of GDP, whatever. This is the logic. If now the objective is also the constraint, that sustainability, you cannot say, yeah, that may be prudent on sustainability, but then I want to do something more. What you want to do? Something unsustainable? So the idea is that we should be hopefully given enough leeway to member states to accommodate within an encompassing path the need for investment. So while also recognizing, let me blunt here, I mean, the communication is full of European priorities, and you can imagine the process of negotiation that led to addition of this and that, and I'm sure that if this translates into legislative proposals that have to go through the Parliament, further objective will be added to the list, because this is my experience of negotiation. But still, the debt sustainability constraint, have to say, and also we have to be aware. Let me also stress another point. I mean, we heard a lot about the RRF. In this case, there is no money coming from the EU level. Not the money from the EU level is money from the sky, as you know. I mean, in the end, there is no free lunch. But still, clearly, the logic is different. The member states remain in the driving seat because these are essentially constraints on their national budget. So we'll also have to recognize that member states may fashion their priority in different ways. So just to conclude on this, an example that came up, which actually in a sense is welcome because it was a bit of a reductio ad absurdum of the argument of fiscal rule. Pretty late in the date, we got requests for a new golden rule for military spending. Right. And you know, you can imagine from which country it came from, which in a sense I welcome because it illustrates the point. You mean you begin with golden rule. Well, I remember many years ago having a lobbyist from the space industry arguing for a golden rule for space exploration. It's true. It's not just a joke. So basically, you have an encompassing path which can be more and less restricted depending on your sustainability situation. And then you have to put your priority within that. I mean, some countries may have very good reason to spend more on the military. And provided you stay within a path which is not as arbitrary, let's say, in the past, you will be able to do so. So, to conclude, yeah, the main objective actually at the forefront is sustainability. At the same time, we give more leeway within this constraint to address European and, let me stress, national priorities.
Thank you. Can I give this question on to Cinzia for two reasons? Cinzia, firstly, I know that you've written a lot on golden rules, so I'd be intrigued about your views here, but also because you said something I felt extremely interesting when we just met outside this hall here at the very beginning, before the event kicked off. You said something to the effect that, is it really possible to do everything we want with these rules? I mean, so what's your view on the objective, and is the current proposal sort of in line with that view?
So let me start with the golden rule. So early this year, we had done quite a bit of thinking about the idea of a golden rule. So my team has been working on social investment. So we sat together and we tried to see how such a golden rule could be defined, but also operationalized. And I have to admit that after an initial excitement, then the excitement went to zero. So let me explain a bit why. So first of all, golden rule basically implies that except for certain investment, we should have a balanced budget. And then the idea is that you can borrow, so issue debt, for investing in something which has a return on future generations, exactly because the debt that you are issuing will be paid by future generations. So there is an underlying idea what is called gold, and an idea that there should be future returns for future generations. So we try to look at social investment, so investment in education, investment also in health. And we realize that if you start to think concretely about how it works, either it's extremely small, that basically becomes irrelevant, or it's huge, which makes the rules irrelevant. So I think it's this is, for me, big lessons learned that, okay, we may have in mind in a principle, we may agree on a principle, but we also need to make sure that this can be operationalized and it can be worked out, because otherwise we are wasting our time. Now, more generally on the proposal of the Commission, I tend to agree on the 2 points, the first 2 points, which were mentioned by Jeromin. So basically, extending the time horizon. This, I think, it was much needed. On the issue of the ownership and the involvement of the national level, and in particular of the national independent fiscal institutions, actually I had many exchanges with a representative of all these different institutions. At CEPS, we hosted the secretariat of the network. So what I'm saying, it's not representing their views, so let me be very clear on this, but I had many exchanges with them. So there is a clear interest in playing a bigger role, and in some countries more than in others, because there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of capacity, in terms of visibility, and in terms of the pressure they can exert on the government. But one issue I see, and that may not be irrelevant, is that for them it is crucial to be perceived as national actors, completely independent from the Commission. Sorry. This is a clear point for them. So the ownership comes from the fact that they are completely disconnected from the EU side. So the question is, can we envisage a situation whereby basically the surveillance is shared by the Commission and the national fiscal institutions, assuming that they cannot really coordinate? Also because this institution, they fears that any coordination can be seen as impairing their national identity, if you want, and their independence. So this, I think, is not a side element, which makes it very difficult to have a sort of shared surveillance.
Thank you. I think you gave me the perfect hint and bridge to build, and to take up something which also Jeromin asked, and which I would like to put to Lucio again, on the relation between the European Commission and the member states when it comes to debt sustainability and the mechanics of the Commission proposal as it stands. Jeromin mentioned something to the effects of there is criticism out there that the Commission might be engaging in bilateral negotiations. Would this be something that you would recognize or take up? So that's one question. Can I add to this maybe another question, of course, from the European Parliament perspective, since we are, of course, discussing here in the heart of the European Parliament, here in Brussels. The second related question is, what's the role of the European Parliament? So on the one hand, what would be, in your view, the nature of the relationship between the Commission and the Member State? And the second question then related to that, well, where does the European Parliament come in? And maybe can I sort of add a third question, if it doesn't complicate it too much? Isn't there a contradiction between the transparency that the Commission sets out to achieve by putting forward templates for national budgets, so, you know, best budget in town, on the one hand, and on the other hand, engaging in these negotiations, I call them negotiations, you might of course dispute this term, in these talks with member states. Is that not a contradiction in the sense that the budget is supposed to be transparent, but the relationship presumably not? Lucio.
Many questions. So let's try to address. I have listened with interest to the criticisms coming from Jeroen, not least because they are shared by other observers to some extent. So when criticisms converge, you have to think about that, even if this is not the intention that you want to convey. So let's be honest about that. Still, I believe that the system is not as commission-centric as Jeroen characterized it on a number of counts. So let me stress, perhaps I will be repeating some of the points that I made before. So in the end, it's the Council that we decide. There will be an element, what we call technical dialogue, you may call it negotiation, upstream of the process, where the starting point, the background will be the reference path provided by the Commission. I have no doubt that there is no doubt in my mind, should this proposal come to fruition, I know that some may differ a bit, so I have to be careful on what I say. Maybe my Director General fully does not agree with me. There will be quite a bit of a difference between the reference path and the final path that is endorsed by the Council. For a number of reasons, not least the fact the reference path will be a bit of a stylized path, based on some kind of assumption, reasonable, but obeying to some mechanical rule. And clearly, when you come to discuss the country-specific situation, you will have different elements. Now, in my view, okay, this looks indeed as an element of bilateralism. However, I think is informed at the beginning and at the end by very clear, two clear elements, as I say. The reference path, which is a reference, as Jeroen recognized, is based on some kind of transparent criteria. The final outcome is endorsed by the Council, so it's not the Commission that decides upon that. In my experience, the bilateralism, and I think I have experience really on this, the bilateralism that has been, for which the Commission has been much criticized, typically used to come in the phase of implementation. So the big challenge, and I have to be honest, is a challenge because based on past experience, some countries, some critics will not believe us, is that once you have the path, you enforce it. So just to give an example, again, coming from the country I'm supposed to know best, we came up with truly ridiculous clauses. I mean, we had a clause for the fall of a bridge in Genoa, in the case of Italy, where a tragic event, but in the broad scheme of things, in the macroeconomic scheme of things, I mean, you cannot pretend that for a large country, you know, the fall of a bridge is a justification from some deviation from the path you should have followed. Clearly, there was a strong political pressure to have something, and so the entire thing was coached in terms of hydrogeological intervention, so on and so forth. So this is the reason I suspect why some argue, well, after all, we can keep the old rule, because on paper, they look very demanding, but then year over year, we can negotiate them away. So the idea here would be to have indeed a process of negotiation upstream, but then do away with the yearly, bazaar bargaining of 0.2, 0.3, and so on and so forth. It is a challenge. I can see why some critics would say no. I mean, in the end, you would fall again into the trap of yearly flexibility. But I think this is an important part of our effort. Now, the role of the European Parliament. Let me say 2 points. One is the basis in the Treaty of Fiscal Surveillance is very clear. So, to be frank, it puts limit to the European Parliament. 126, which is the basis of the EDP, perhaps because it was conceived back at the time of Maastricht and it has not been changed since. It's one of the articles that remains really the same, doesn't envisage really a role for the European Parliament, except in terms of legislation. Actually, when it comes to the EDP regulation, as you know, technically speaking, there is just a consultation procedure, but the whole package clearly will be effectively ordinary legislative procedure when the process comes. Now, we do envisage another role which we believe is important. It has also been criticized already by some, in terms of the enforcement. So when discussing the issue of smart sanction, one point which I think is evoked explicitly by the communication is basically to call ministers to justify or articulate their position precisely when the Commission finds that they are deviating by the common rule. And I think this would be already something existing in the current legislation, has not been applied much. We would like it to be more systematically. Well, interestingly, already we heard from some member state opposition. They don't like the idea. They say, no, the European Parliament should not be there. I mean, this is a process that should be managed by the Commission, the Council on one hand, and the concerned member state. So this is a point that I can make on this.
Thank you. I know that Irene has a point. I know there are questions already in the room. Just a reminder to the audience online, you can also raise your virtual hand and or ask questions in the chat, and we will take this up. We'll come to questions in a moment, but I know Irene wanted to raise a point and come in here.
So two reactions to what Lucio just said and maybe my answer to your question on the European Parliament. So the first reaction to what you just said is, so there is a bit of a tension with the way you describe the proposal, or rather you argue that it's not as Commission-centric as it seems, and just the language of the proposal, right? So the language of the communication does come across as is very Commission-centric, and you know, I've tried to explain why that is. And in fact, it's not completely plausible for the reasons that you have just explained. Ultimately, the Council does have the last word, right? But there's language in there that really does create this impression, and I can only speculate that this is because at the end of the day, you put in this language based on, who you are sensitive to in the last iteration of the drafting, right? And so I think this will go away, as we discuss this proposal. So I'm not too worried about this. But I think it's still fair to point this out, and particularly, I see myself as a bridge between, in a sense, the critics and the things that the Commission is trying to do, which I completely support. I mean, particularly the DSA based, and so I need to play that role. Then I just want to acknowledge that you made a really important point, which was also not in the proposal, but that's totally fine, which is to say that actually the flexibility that that some member states have been sensitive to in the past is something that happens in the enforcement process, in the ex post rather than in the ex ante. I think that is very important. And indeed, there's much less flexibility. It's a much tougher proposal on that side, because if this is implemented the way it's intended, countries are supposed to enact binding multi-year expenditure ceilings, right, in these net terms. And so the Commission, in that sense, is really tying its hands. So this is a very important point. However, it does not completely address the bilateral negotiation sphere, in part because if you tie your hands on the exposed, it is completely reasonable to assume, and indeed I would expect, that the negotiation will shift to the ex ante, and then you would like some even clearer, even better specified criteria on how the ex ante should work. And I think you're actually relatively close. I think you just need to go one step further on doing that. And then finally, the role of the Parliament. You see, I think, just like several others, I think the introductory speaker said this too, that indeed the use of discretion is unavoidable if we're not going to have rules that exposed just don't fit, right, the situation. You will need discretion. This is the beauty of the approach that the Commission is proposing. With the possibility of discretion, there always comes the possibility of abuse of discretion. And so the whole thing is an exercise in a structured, transparent use of discretion, where, in my view, and this is maybe the one sense in which I differ from the Commission's proposal, there need to be several checks and balances in the system. So it's completely fair to say that the Commission is the only officially recognized check and balance in addition to the Council. But I think that in practice, this needs to be expanded because the burden is just too high. And so this is why I and many, many other people, including Lucio, have been advocating for a bigger role of national fiscal councils. So when I said they have to share the surveillance responsibility, I did not mean that they have to collaborate with the Commission. They have to be independently empowered to apply the law, the national law and the European law, and they're independent, so they can do that. But in the same vein, I also think that the European Parliament has a role to play as an additional check and balance by essentially having a debate on whether the spirit and the letter of the rules are followed, by inviting the national policy makers to explain themselves, which is, by the way, a point that is made in the Commission proposal and which I apply. They are very much part, they are the loudest voice, if you like, of democratic check and balance that we have. And so that is an informal role. It's not in the Article 126, but it's nonetheless an extremely informal role that ought to be upgraded, just like the role of national fiscal councils.
Thank you. I know there are questions already in the room. I know that Caius Hagestam has a question. Caius is my colleague, head of unit in the European Parliament's EGOV unit. Caius.
Thank you very much. Does it work? Yes. Thanks for the timely debate, and it's a very complex subject, of course. I think in Commission, in your trailer of the reform, you mentioned that this should be the reform for the decade. And if that's the case, of course, I think a critical assessment of the reform is probably warranted, because we have done this now for 20 years. We had 20 years of the euro, and during the first decade, we had the simple rules, which were said are too simple, we cannot follow them, they are stupid. And then after the euro crisis, we went for the very detailed rules, and I had the pleasure to be part of the negotiation team with the Parliament as in the Secretariat and working a lot closely with Lucio at the time. And at the time, we felt we were doing a good job. We felt these rules are perfect. We are doing them so well, they would take into account every circumstances, and Lucio was fully behind it. Now, 10 years later, we know we couldn't apply them fully. Okay, it's not the fault of the goodwill of the EU institutions. We wanted to do the good rules. It was not the bad will of the politicians. The reality was there. Again, we talked about that earlier, the institutional design of the EMU, where we will never have the perfect rules because we don't know how to enforce them. So my remark maybe is more general, that maybe in 10 years' time, after the next decade, we are sitting here discussing, oh, why did we move to so much discretion? We couldn't apply them because it's not politically feasible. So I'm saying that one needs a kind of a critical approach when discussing the topic. I think it's totally warranted, and happy to hear that also from the other speakers. Now, maybe two questions then, more specific on this trialer. Now, are we thinking that the net expenditure rule, it's political ownership because it's built up, it's easier to understand, it's easier to communicate. But then, if this so-called national ownership, due to one reason or the other, maybe elections, would not be fully there, how will we enforce in good times sanctions or reputational sanctions on that government if it's not fully compliant with the net expenditure rule? How will that be done? It's not probably spelled out fully yet in the Commission proposal. And then the other thing, I think that Cinzia and Jerome, you have worked a lot on debt sustainability assessment, and even Alicia made a paper to us at the time, the state of art of DSAs. And it was very appreciated at the time. But there again, we all know DSA is an art and not a science. So we're building up a surveillance framework and a debt adjustment pact based on a kind of a picture of the sustainability. And my question would be then that are we thinking about how it fits into the context of the euro area? Is DSA's assessment similar if you don't have your own monetary policy reaction function? So we know from our past that in the euro crisis, everybody thought everything was fine. We thought that the debt is fine for the countries, but it was non-linear. It was non-sustainable over the night when we had an external financial shocks outside, and it only revealed the problems we had inside. So it came non-linearly aware for policymakers and economists that there was not the fully sustainable public finances in all countries. So can we do an DSA that somehow takes into account this kind of situation that we are in the euro area, and that's maybe a bit different from one which has its own monetary policy and exchange rate policy? Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Caius. Two questions there, very pertinent. I guess the first one goes to Lucio. What happens if the Commission agrees a long-term plan with a member state and then elections interfere and there's a different government? And then the second question I would put to both Cinzia as well as Jerome, if you would like to come in on this one. And obviously, Lucio, feel free to comment also on whatever else Caius said. Yeah,
okay. Good to see Caius. Indeed, I remember the time when we were both a bit younger that we negotiated. We negotiated a reform that we thought would last, well, I shouldn't say forever, not last forever, but perhaps... Okay, I think as Cinzia said, it's much easier to see things clearly in the aftermath. So I will stop here. No, on the specific question, what happens in case of election? The communication is a communication, so it's fairly detailed. It cannot give all the answer. As you can imagine, we are working now, both with the aim of coming up with draft legislation on any way to answer questions that are coming from member states, first of all, and also from other quarters. So don't take what I'm saying as the position of the Commission. I think that we have to recognize that if you have elections in particular, so the issue of a change of government then becomes more delicate. You know, there are some countries that change government rather frequently in the space of a legislature. But let's focus on the case of election. You have to recognize that there, or at least this is my view, there must be the possibility for the government coming up from new elections, so a new electoral mandate, to submit a new plan. To caveat, one obvious, one has to go through the same process, so it's not that the government can just announce unilaterally, since there have been new elections, we are the expression of a new political mandate, now our path is unilaterally modified this way. So there will be this multilateral process. The other caveat is that, let's say, the sustainability constraint in terms of reference path and criteria still must hold. So, which brings me to an issue. I mean, it would be good, I know that there will be a lot of discussion if this comes to fruition, that member states do not take reference path as just, you know, the basis from which to negotiate something that goes beyond. Because then you reach a certain limit, and after which then it would be very little to negotiate in the future. So with these two caveats, which to me seems rather obvious, I would recognize that at least, I mean, in the case of a change of legislature, I mean, democracy is the founding value of the EU. So, I mean, we have to, how much we like to impose the rule, we have to take this on board. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. I pass on the second question to both Cinzia first, I guess, and then Irene on, is debt sustainability an art or a science?
I will start off with this last point, and this is actually something I wrote in the paper. So it was, it's more an art than a science. And basically, I remember it was 2016, I think, because I recall that we were looking at that sustainability assessment on Greece, which was made by the Commission and the IMF on the last package. So it must just after 2015. And basically, what we found was that the final judgment, the final assessment based on the DSA was different for the Commission and the IMF. And basically, technically, that there was, the difference was basically in one of the parameters of the DSA. Now, this is a very specific case, and it was rather a static approach, no stochastic DSA, so you can do actually many things. But it was quite a clear example that there is an element of judgment in the DSA. So this was the bottom line message, and that's basically why the conclusion was more a science, more an art than a science. But maybe Irene has a different view on this. But let me pick up on a couple of points that Caius made, because I think that they are important. Now, on the rules, I mean, thinking of a new fiscal framework and new rules in a backward-looking way, so trying to fight the last war, or in a forward-looking way. I think we all agree that it needs to be in a forward-looking way, but we also need to learn the lessons from the past. So, in fact, we do not have the crystal ball, and we don't know what shock will be next. As I said earlier, we had 3 low probability events basically happening in a decade. So it's actually very likely that there will be large shocks, or the frequency of large shocks is likely to be higher than in the past. At least this is a clear lessons learned. So in this sense, I think it's important that there is a certain discretionary elements to have the possibility to be able to respond to shocks. Now, that said, I have to say that in my home country, which is the same one as Lucio, basically the fiscal rules have been used as a scapegoat to justify the growth problems of the last 20 years. So there was often a debate, we cannot use sufficiently fiscal policy because we have the rules. I think what is not often or enough said is that basically the big problem with procyclicality is not only in times of recessions, is actually also in times of when things are going well, because Italy didn't really have a big expansion in the last 20 years. But basically, when you are in a recession, what is also binding, other than the rules, is the reaction of financial markets. I think we have not mentioned until now financial markets. But if you have a very large debt, basically you are vulnerable to financial market turbulences. So, in fact, what may be more constraining in a framework where there is a certain degree of discretion is basically what is happening on financial markets. And basically whether you have enough discretionary room to find borrowers to finance your debt. And I think this is a crucial element that will play an important element and maybe will define even more to what extent rules will be constraining or not and discretionary, not so large. Thank you.
That was probably a hint at the ghost of London, if I may interpret your words, maybe, on financial markets and debt. But Jeromin, please.
So DSAs are like democracy. It's a terrible system, but it's the best one that we have. And part of the reason for that is because they are open, just like democracy is open. So they're defined in terms of a general purpose. There are some generally recognized principles. So the IMF's definition of debt sustainability, for example, is that debt is sustainable if you can achieve a non-explosive debt path with acceptable rollover risk using feasible fiscal adjustment. So that's a nice definition, and then you can basically invent your techniques around that, and the techniques can change over time, and they have changed. Is it a particular problem to do this in a currency union? So I don't think so. I mean, there is one issue, which is that, you know, there is, you are, of course, assuming the place is not going to break up, right? So there's this underlying assumption. I mean, I think it would be sort of silly to have a stress test where you say that it's sustainable subject to breakup. But other than that, I think it's pretty standard. What I think was true in the 2000s is that we underestimated the role of quasi-fiscal liabilities, right? That was the whole problem in several countries. I mean, this is what brought Spain to the brink. It wasn't the fiscal per se, but most modern DSA techniques have tests that do that. The IMF one has a test where you're essentially supposed to check that. I'm sure there is something similar in the Commission's proposal.
Thank you. The DSA being a terrible system, but the one we have is certainly a phrase that I will take with me from this event. We will have to group questions now because there are lots of questions in the room, some questions also online. The lady sitting here in the room on the third row first, and then a question online, which will be read out by my colleague Peter Bart.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting seminars. My name is Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics and member of the European Physical Society. And I have a question concerning the crisis times. Because of the war, Russian war in Ukraine, we are in a recession time, will be in the next year. My question is, how do you have a risk fiscal and monetary policy for crisis time, like recession, like financially crisis, like in 2008, energy crisis? How your policy respond to this crisis time? I didn't see it here in your speech. No?
Thank you. Forward-looking question. An online question. Peter, will you read it out or will we connect?
So, hi, indeed, a question online. And this is coming from students of Professor Vela from the University of Pavia in Italy. So there's lots of interest coming from Italy on this subject. The students are asking, saying, well, Europe is always is innovating, finding new instruments in crisis times and therefore making leaps forward, whether that is, for example, with the RRF we've seen in the COVID crisis. But they're asking now, we are seeing a crisis in the global order. This is, we're sitting in a global conflict, perhaps a global recession. How can fiscal policy change globally? Perhaps we are basically broadening this debate. I mean, what instruments are needed in fiscal policy in general across the globe to attack these to give an answer to these crises in terms of climate change, digital, etc.
Well, two very similar questions. Forward-looking, what is basically missing in the current debate? If I may paraphrase both questions. Who would like to take these? Maybe Cinzia?
Maybe I give a first try quickly. So I think two aspects of fiscal policy. One is the crisis response. So in a sense, the stabilization capacity that fiscal policies should have in response to a shock. And the second one, at least the way I understand it, is in a more forward-looking way to what extent fiscal policy can support future growth and more long-term challenges, so basically through investments. So on the first question, I mean, in response to the current crisis, actually, at the level of the member states, there has been quite a lot of new instruments which have been put in place, and most of them have taken the form, basically, of support to households, in particular to most vulnerable households, in terms of compensating for the loss of purchasing power due to the increase in the energy and the electricity prices. So member states have used their own discretion and their own way to respond to the crisis. So there is quite a lot of heterogeneity across the member states. So this has been, until now, the main response. So there has been some discussion at the European level whether there was need for sort of next generation 2.0, some sort of common response using basically a common budget. This is an issue which has been discussed now for more than a decade, whether there is a need for an EU fiscal capacity. And basically the possibility to have a pot of resources which can be used in response to shocks, and in particular to common shocks. I think that there is certainly not agreement yet to have something in addition to Next Generation EU and the RRF. The RRF is in full deployment, so the national recovery plans are starting to be implemented right now. So I do not see any political will at the moment to go for something in addition to it. What some member states are also asking is to have some room of maneuver to redirect what has been agreed in the plans in order to meet the challenges of this new energy crisis. And I think REPowerEU, in a sense, goes in this direction. So, bottom line, I would say quite a lot, mostly national response to the current crisis, so from national governments, and some reorientation, to limited reorientation within the funds of Next Generation EU. Quickly on the second point, which is more in terms of long term. So, fiscal policy is an element, is a competence which is essentially national. So no taxation without representation. This is a Brit way of putting the story, but it's in practice, spending public money is a power which is given to a government, which is basically using the taxpayers' money. So so in this sense, envisaging international cooperation is certainly not an easy exercise. It's even difficult within the EU, where we have a common framework. Actually, one of the objectives of the rules is to have coordination of fiscal policies. Now, more specifically on spending public money to face the challenges which are closely linked to the next generation, the Commission has put in Next Generation EU the digital and the green transitions as the key elements guiding future investment and future spending of the money coming from the EU. So in this sense, that there is a growing awareness that something needs to be done for the future generation. On the other side, and this it's a bit more negative, it's that the current situation has basically led to a significant increase in debt, and that will have to be repaid by future generations. So bright and less bright side of the story.
I'm not sure, Irene, would you like to comment? Or?
I agree with Cinzia. So I think for those common challenges, we really do need either generally a federal budget or just a bigger EU budget common borrowing would be nice. The only way to do this sustainably is to have the so-called own resources at the EU level, and that's a problem because you need essentially the taxes, right? You need taxation power. I actually think we are fine on democratic legitimacy because we do have a representation. It's right here. We are sitting in it. But the real problem is that resources are finite. So whatever we give to the European level, we're taking away either directly or indirectly from the national level. So we're going to make a bigger federal budget. We have to decrease the state budgets. That's really, really difficult, but I think it's needed.
Thank you. I think that merits a follow-up discussion, but we've almost come to the end of our discussion. I have 3 more questions in the room. Can I ask the participants to be very brief? 30 seconds per questions. I have a gentleman at the back, a gentleman here on the red sofa, and a gentleman here in the front. And then we take one last round of answers collectively as a response to all 3 questions, as well as to everything else that has been raised and said.
Thank you very much. I would like to emphasize a bit on monetary policy because we didn't discuss about it. We had TPI, we had OMT, but in December, and President Lagarde mentioned that yesterday in Monetary Dialogue, we will have quantitative tightening. We mentioned financial markets and fragmentation in financial markets when it comes to interest rates. And we see that countries do not have the fiscal capacity to deal with this problem. Is the new fiscal framework prepared to deal with these problems coming from tightening or coming in the short term? And how are we going to build more effective coordination with these rules? Thank you.
Lessons and interplay, monetary and fiscal policy. The gentleman here.
Thanks. So my question is on the DSA. The Commissioner Gentiloni last week in Strasbourg alluded in his speech to plenary on the costs of climate inaction to basically the economy and also the ability to sustain the debt. So I was wondering whether it's already reflected in the methodology of this work going on in ECFIN to include in the DSA methodology how failing to mitigate and adapt to climate change is going to reduce debt sustainability. That's on the side of the path. On the side of the expenditure, if you want to extend your plan from 4 years to 7 years, the additional fiscal space, there's some conditionality. It's either digital, social, or green reforms and investment. Since we, I think, can all agree that the green transition is one of the top priorities going forward, how binding is that going to be, and can you really just focus on digital and social and not do anything on green, bearing in mind that there's no additional funds in the European Green Deal, so it's national funds that are going to do this?
Thank you. Stefano, in the front row.
Thanks. My question is about debt sustainability and taxation. So how we can get the debt reduction, or at least the debt on GDP reduction in some countries that we know very well and they need, if we don't act on something that is called tax evasion or can be tax optimization. The only solution that we adopt in the last, I think, decades is to make the same pressure on the same people with more taxation or cutting budget without looking to a better management on public finance. I think that is like you have a sick family and you act always to give the medicine to the same people but not to the person who has the virus. And that creates a problem with the doctor, which is seen to be in Brussels. So how the new economic governance can correct these kind of things? Thanks.
Thank you for these very pertinent questions, all 3 of them. Can we go in reverse order? And this will automatically also be the final round because it's 12:30. Maybe Jeromin first, and Cinzia and Lucio.
I've talked a lot, but so I will not address most of the points. I think they are mainly for my 2 co-panelists. But on the green stuff and how to put it into DSA. First, I think it's important to do it. It can be done. The last thing I did before leaving the IMF was to prepare a guidance note for the new IMF's DSA, which has a climate module where we show how in principle it could be done. The problem, however, is that this is not going to be, for the most part, one of those public investments that gets you, some trade-off vis-à-vis fiscal adjustment, right? Because this is not investment that pays for itself through higher growth. It is, of course, economically rational investment because it prevents a climate disaster in the future. But the only way to pay for it is actually to spend less in other areas or to raise taxes.
Maybe very quickly on the question on the monetary policy and the coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think we are entering in a phase where for the ECB will be more difficult to be supportive of the economy. This is becoming quite clear because control of inflation is the mission of the ECB, and the room of maneuver to use all the tools will be more limited. I mean, until now it has been, again, the main player because even if there was not full support, there was still space within the mandate, basically to support the economy. Now we are moving in a different context. And I think also from the ECB is becoming more clear that some other player will have to stand up. And of course, this will be fiscal policy. Now, I think that the new framework, in principle, gives more room for discretion. So in principle, government should have more room, again, to support the economy if and when needed. Again, my main concern is whether this discretion can be fully used and whether this is of the same degree for member states. So sorry, it's a bit of a rhetoric question for me because it's clearly not the case.
Lucio.
Well, right. Many questions. Let's try to pick up the main point that I'd like. I mean, we have to be aware of the limit of what we are doing, let me say. And what I mean in reacting to many of the questions I've put. So here we are discussing the macro dimension of fiscal policy. So we are not entering in the composition of taxes and expenditure, which is extremely relevant, but it's not the purpose of the fiscal rules. We are discussing fiscal rule for Europe, where coordination is difficult enough, let alone through the war. And let me say, although my work has been mainly on macroeconomic issue, and particularly on fiscal policy, we should be aware of the limitation of what fiscal policy can achieve. So fiscal policy can make big blunders, may save a country in certain circumstances of big crisis, but you will not achieve long-term growth thanks to the macroeconomic orientation of fiscal policy. And I'm afraid there are illusions in this respect that I have to be dispelled. So some of the things that you're looking after, you cannot get from macroeconomic policy, you can get from productive enterprises. I think it is very important. On the DSA, the greenery, little to add to what Irene has been said. We are also trying to add a module that takes into account the cost, the increasing cost, but of climate change. It is all very experimental. In the future also we'll have to be more, not only more open, but let's say more subject to member states' will when it comes to this, because precisely the DSA begins to have a role in fiscal surveillance. To point, what we are doing is something medium term that is already, here we have also to face a big problem. On the one hand, we already received the criticism that we are taking too much of a long-term perspective because government change, legislature change, so a medium-term approach already 4 years or 7 years is too much. At the same time, we are aware that issues such as the one of the green transition span, this is a contradiction of our polity, in a sense. Span an horizon that goes beyond the horizon of a government, goes beyond the horizon of a parliament. So I don't have the silver bullet there. But let me stress again, this element of humility, not as too much of macro fiscal policy. And there are many things that you could do differently within the same macro envelope. You know, it's a matter of distribution between revenues and expenditure, or within revenues and within expenditure. So in this respect, so I'm not recommending here a product by the Commission, but I found it, but in fact, something which has come out again from the Peterson Institute. Olivier Blanchard, whose vitality one can only admire, has come up recently with Jean Tirole and another co-author that I don't remember, with a piece discussing issue of climate changes, where he highlights some of the trade-offs and the problem, and also the misperception that often occur in this field. So I can only recommend to you to read it if you have not already done.
Thank you so much for these sobering words, and also for the words which put this discussion here into perspective. The fog outside has lifted, so that's the good news. The bad news is that it's still overcast, which I think is a good image for this discussion and the topic. I would like to thank all three discussants for having come here in person. It's taken a big chunk of your time. Thank you so much for putting in this effort. I would like to thank the audience, both online and in person, and remind you that this event today is part of a larger series of the EPRS. We will continue next Tuesday with a discussion purely online on the importance of the euro in the global economy, where we have Danuta Hübner, MEP, discussing with Isabel van Steenkiste, Director General of the ECB. We have Sophie Javary from BNP Paribas and Hyun Song-shin from the Bank for International Settlements. Thank you so much for being with us online and in person. Have a good day. Thank you to all.